people, but well, all right, well, welcome. To start with, just by way of initial sort of superfluous adieu, let me just say that how happy I am that we are back together, those of us that are back together in person, if only to a limited extent. Let's hope that we can all be back together, minus the electronic interfaces next year in Vancouver. I am happy and honored for the opportunity to introduce Bruce Caldwell, Distinguished Fellow of the History of Economics Society for the year 2020. I want to keep this short. I don't want to cut into Bruce's lecture, which is sure to be far more interesting than anything that I have to say. But I would be remiss if I did not remind the members of the Society about Professor Caldwell's many and significant contributions to our field. Recall that Professor Caldwell, generally referred among those in the know as the world's leading expert on F.A. Hayek, would be a worthy recipient of the Distinguished Fellow Award, even if he had never written a word about Hayek. In some parts of the world, Caldwell is still best known for Beyond Positivism, published in 1982, one of the most important books in economic methodology of the last 50 years. The book's appearance was timely, arriving just as economics was suffering another of its occasional crises. Beyond Positivism combined a critical analysis of the significance of economics for, the significance for economics of 20th century philosophy of science with a pioneering argument for methodological pluralism. Such a pluralistic understanding of economic method, Caldwell argued, would encourage original thinking, dialogue between members of competing schools of thought, and a humble approach to criticism. Despite the book's success and the professional interest raised by Caldwell's argument, it cannot be said that the positive program of methodological pluralism was widely adopted in the economics profession. Nevertheless, the book remains influential 40 years after its publication. Indeed, my South American friends tell me that the book is still regularly taught in the region as an introductory text. Around the time that Beyond Positivism was published, Caldwell developed an interest in Hayek. A tendentious debate with Terence Hutchison, 1984 Distinguished Fellow of the HES, provided Caldwell with his first opportunity to make a significant mark on the Hayekian secondary literature. Hayek's so-called transformation was not, as Hutchison had claimed, a turn away from Ludwig von Mises in the direction of Karl Popper, but a rejection of the narrow brand of static equilibrium theorizing common in the mainstream of the profession in favor of a broader dynamic conception of social order and of the processes that either promote or impede its realization. This work culminated in 2004's Hayek's Challenge, Caldwell's authoritative intellectual biography of Hayek, and in Caldwell's ascension to the role of general editor of the collected works of F.A. Hayek. Caldwell wields a peerless, yet always humble and kind authority among Hayek scholars. His work has set the terms of the discussion in such a way that new contributions to the Hayekian secondary literature must survive the crucible of his scholarship if they are to be taken seriously. As author of the best regarded intellectual biography of one of the 20th century's most influential thinkers, Caldwell's name is already well known beyond the narrow world of Hayek scholars, and this recognition will only increase with the eventual publication of the full biography of Hayek, meant to serve as capstone to the collected works project that Caldwell is currently writing with his co-author, Hans-Lord Klausinger. Unlike some academics who choose to engage in the hermeneutics of suspicion, groundlessly attributing the worst of motives to and interpreting in the least charitable way the writings of their intellectual opponents, Caldwell always opts for a hermeneutics of generosity. Caldwell never casts aspersions upon the self-reports of a targeted adversary or reads their words as euphemistic cover for more dubious motives. Caldwell's work exemplifies the method recognized by logicians since time immemorial as the most effective dialectical strategy of countering his opponent's most challenging and best substantiated argument, rather than an absurd caricature of his own construction. As if Caldwell's literary contributions could somehow be deemed inadequate, the role that he has played in founding and sustaining Duke Center for the History of Political Economy more than justifies the title of Distinguished Fellow. He has created something like Disneyland for historians of economic thought. The only thing missing from the Hope Center is an animatronic Hayek. The Hope Center offers research fellows the opportunity to engage with several of the leading scholars in the field, as well as the chance to access one of the most comprehensive archives of economist papers anywhere in the world. The center has played a vital role in maintaining the history of economic thought in the United States, and its continued success is integral to sustaining the field in the long run. I want to suggest, however, that the splendors of the Hope Center ultimately lie in the fact that Caldwell has effectively and surely without intending it, erected a temple to the very methodological pluralism defended in Beyond Positivism. There is no mainstream at the Hope Center. There are no teams. All perspectives on the history of economic thought are welcome, provided in keeping with the principles of pluralism, one clarifies their own assumptions and minimizes unfounded external criticisms of competing perspectives. As Caldwell argued 40 years ago, this open-minded approach encourages dialogue between members of rival schools. Caldwell's Hope Center is dogmatic only in its rejection of dogma. Perhaps most importantly, this humble approach comes across in Caldwell's contacts with early career scholars. I was lucky enough to participate in 3 of the Hope Center's summer institutes, and Caldwell's scholarly integrity is apparent to all participants, regardless of their perspective on the history of economic thought. His work and his personal character are examples to aspiring Hayek scholars and young Marxists alike. For all of these reasons, I am honored to introduce Bruce Caldwell, if a year late, as 2020 Distinguished Fellow of the History of Economics Society. Please join me in congratulating Bruce.
I think I'm mic'd up. Am I mic'd up?
Yeah.
So I'll just, not sure how to turn it off. Oops. Well, that was the nicest introduction I've ever received, and I'm a bit stunned by it. But thank you, thank you. I thought you were overly generous. It made me want to meet this Caldwell. Well, I am also glad to finally be amongst my tribe in person and also talking to people who are joining remotely. It's wonderful to be back together again. The center has been running its programs through the COVID period, although people were masked while they were talking, and it was kind of, we had to cut back on certain lecture series and other things, but I think we're finally getting back to something approximating normal. It's certainly a very welcome thing. So the title of my talk is Hayek and Me. And my plan was simply to talk a little bit about the biography that Scott mentioned, Hayek, A Life, 1899 to 1950. For those of you who know anything about Hayek, he lived till 1992. So of course, this is just the first of 2 volumes. Hans Jorg and I have been working on it for a decade. That was a big amount of work. It's coming out in October. And I thought what I would do is simply to talk a bit about the process. Okay, so it's a big book. It's a co-authored book. And it's a book that's a biography, not an intellectual biography, although there are elements of intellectual biography in it. So I thought for this audience that you might want to know a little bit about the process that we went through to do it, the sources that we used. And then some of the things in the second part of the talk, I talk about what I learned new about Hayek in doing this sort of really different sort of endeavor, a full biography. And then last week, Roy Montrose at me, and he said, look, Bruce, the title is Hayek and Me. You should tell people why you've been working on Hayek for 35 years. Okay. And he put it in a very gentle way. He said, you're a good scholar. People would want to know that. But basically, he also kind of suggested, at least I had a sense that you want people to know that you're not a lunatic. Stop raving mad. Why would you devote yourself to this one thing for so many decades, for God's sake? So I was having drinks, of course, last night with Eddie, Nick, Steve Medema, and they echoed Roy's plea. So I went back to the room and got up this morning and wrote up some additional stuff that I would tell you. Now, some of this is stuff that Scott already was in his generous introduction talked about. So I'll be brief. And if this part is boring, Steve and Eddie are here. You can take it up with them after this session. Okay. So what I was impressed with as I just was starting to recall, the path that I took so many years with Hayek was how random some of the elements were, especially at the beginning. So economics, why did you first study economics? I was a sophomore. I got closed out of sociology and psychology. Okay, you're supposed to take a social science when you're a sophomore. And it was registration in a gym. That's how they did it back in the old days. And they started registration in the middle of the alphabet. By the time I got to the C's, I went to the tables for sociology, psychology, closed out. I have to take a social science. What am I going to do? There's this little table, this little guy sitting there, economics. Oh, geez. And that's how I got into economics. I figured it was, I was a campus radical sort, Vietnam War period, protest the war and all that. And I'm thinking, economics, this is about studying business. I had no idea what it was. Took it. I didn't like economics all that much, but I grew to like it more as an undergraduate. But I was much more interested in philosophy and history, other sorts of big question sorts of disciplines. But when I graduated, it was the middle of a recession, the beginning of the stagflation, and there were no jobs. And so I couldn't work, so I thought, well, what do you do when there's no jobs? You go to grad school. And I thought, well, philosophy. And I talked to the philosophers. I said, you can go to grad school, you can go to Princeton, come out with 2 articles, you're not going to be able to get a job. Don't do it. It's not worth it. So I went to grad school in economics. I figured at least you can get a job in economics. I hated grad school in economics. It was the worst experience of my life. It was so dry. It's not that I hated economics. By that point, I started to like economics, but I liked economics that I learned as an undergraduate. And it seemed to me that the stuff I was learning as a grad student was simply doing the same stuff with not adding much to information about the economy or thoughtfulness about economics. I asked my teachers, why is what we're doing so different from the way it was as an undergrad? They looked at me like I was from Mars. Who asks questions like that? So it was in grappling with the difference between those 2 educational experiences that I first became interested in methodology. And again, as luck would have it, at UNC, where I did my graduate work, there was a guy who had written a dissertation on Pareto's methodology, Mr. Azier. So there was somebody who could actually say, okay, if you want to write on this weird stuff, I'll supervise your dissertation. So that's how I got into the interest in methodology that was mentioned by Scott. And 4 years later, have my degree, still no jobs, because we're talking about later period of stagflation. And I know many people in history of thought these days worry about getting jobs. Well, everybody always worries about getting jobs in history of thought. This has always been the case. So, just get over it. Recognize that as part of the cost of pursuing this passion. It is a passion. But there were I got a few interviews, nobody called. It's April, and suddenly, and here's where the Austrians came in. I get called by UNC Greensboro, and they say, look, we'd like to interview you. They ended up giving me a job. Now, what had happened there was a guy who had studied Austrian stuff and had been almost hired by them. They had gotten all the way to the point of not executing the contract, but they thought they had hired him. He ended up getting another job offer that was better, and took it. And so they were left high and dry. This is a state institution. If you don't hire if you have a slot to hire somebody, and you don't hire somebody, the next year you could lose that slot. So they wanted to hire someone, and I was left in the market. So they had interviewed me at the general meetings, but that's how I got my first job. So it was serendipity all the way, unbeknownst to me, unintended consequence of an action, but a guy studying Austrian economics. As a result of that, the people at UNCG, the department head said, look, you're interested in methodology. These Austrians have this weird methodology. You might want to look into that a little bit. So that was what got me into attending my first incident of exposure, really, to Austrian economics. Was a 2-week-long summer institute in Boulder, Colorado. 3 sessions a day. Israel Kerzner, Jerry O'Driscoll, and Roger Garrison were the instructors. It's about 25, 30 people. I had more intellectual stimulation in those 2 weeks than I'd had in 4 years of grad school. That was the way I felt. I was so stimulated after those 2 weeks. Now, it shows you how bad grad school was, I mean, in terms of my experience. And it wasn't because I thought, oh God, I've seen the light. I was a radical. I disagreed with him constantly. I was Eddie, okay? I was not Pete Becky. I was Eddie Nick Cobb, okay? Amongst the Austrians. And I'm just, arguing. And they're arguing back. And, we'd have 2 sessions and then a 3rd session late afternoon. Then we're in the dorm and Jerry O'Driscoll would walk in with a case of beer and say, let's keep going. And we just keep going. I mean, it's the first time I really felt I had true intellectual stimulation. So that kind of hooked me on wanting to learn more about them because I thought they were offering some pretty interesting arguments. And ended up going to NYU for a year to study with the Austrians. Got an invitation to go there. And it was on a postdoc, and that was where I first started to learn about Hayek. I mean, for me, the Austrians was von Mises because his such a big figure and his methodology was so interesting. And so one thing I followed after another conference that I directed at Duke. When Duke first acquired the Carl Menger papers, they decided to have a conference on that. And I directed, that was, I guess, the first Hope conference actually. And then in the 90s, two other episodes, seminal moments occurred in terms of not just getting into Hayek, but changing the way I did my research. So in 1991, I went to the Hoover Institution. I was interested in Karl Popper because of this methodology stuff, methodology debates that I've been having with Hutchison and others in the 80s. And went to the Hoover Institution, met with Bill Bartley, who was a Popper scholar, and spent a week in the Hayek archives. And it was, again, it just blew my mind. Now, of course, there's the tactile stimulus of holding these letters that have been written by people like Keynes and Hayek and Scheall, Popper and all the rest. And their handwriting, seeing all the different, just getting into that aspect. I was hooked by that. I really liked that. But the particular episode that I was looking at, I had for a decade tried to figure out what Popper's Poverty of a Store System, this little book, what was that? What was going on in that book? He called it a stodgy book. I found it incomprehensible. The first half of it didn't make any sense if you looked at the second half. The first half made sense, the second half made sense. What was going on? And I spent a week in the archives and I'm looking at the correspondence between Popper and Hayek, and I recognized, well, Popper was in New Zealand during World War II. Hayek was at LSE. They get into contact with each other because they met at LSE in the 30s when Popper was traveling through, hoping to get a job, but find a job somewhere in England, but couldn't, ended up going to New Zealand. Hayek is writing about scientism and historicism as an element of that. Popper is writing the poverty of historicism. Hayek accepted the first half, which was written, of the poverty of historicism into Economica. And then Hayek had sent him his own writings on scientism. So here's this guy who's the editor who's accepted your paper, and you're recognizing that he believes that there's a difference between the natural sciences and the social sciences and method. And you, Popper, think, no, all sciences follow the same method. What are you going to do? You don't want to publish a paper that directly contradicts the guy who you're seeing as kind of saving their academic life in many ways. He ended up helping bring Popper to LSE. But anyway, Popper adjusted what he wrote in order to still maintain his own views, but make them compatible with Hayek's views. And that explained to me something I've been troubled about for a decade. And it made me realize that if you're going to do history of economic thought, up until that point, I was not an historian of economics. I was just looking at texts and look at a text from 1927 and a text from 1962, and we try to figure out how they're coherent with each other or point out contradictions. That's not the way to do history of economics, at least in my view. If you're trying to figure out why this, the fact that one text might differ from another text is just your starting point. The point is, what was the person doing then? What was the person doing then? Why are those things different? How did he get from A to B? These are the sorts of questions that suddenly became important to me. In the same decade, in the 1990s, I was asked to do 2 of the editor's introductions for volumes in the collected works. And there I had to show the context for why the roads of that were. It was Contra Keynes in Cambridge, was one of the volumes, another was his writing on socialism. Who was he responding to at this point? Why was he writing this particular way? Why did he have these arguments? So it was in that period that I really made this transition from being interested in methodology to doing history of thought. And the culmination was, the book Hayek's Challenge, which was dubbed an intellectual history, but really it carried over the interest in methodology because the actual subtitle was supposed to be F.A. Hayek and the Limits of Social Science. That was what I was writing about in that. And a lot of the ideas that I got are in the epilogue to that. But it was at that point that I could have just stopped with Hayek for sure, okay, because I've written the book. But then I got offered the chance to be the general editor. And this is the general editor of Collected Works. I would have to raise money to help produce this thing. So I had to figure out how to do that. But I also was supposed to meet the Hayek, I had to meet the Hayek family. Before we saw any kind of contracts, I had to meet Hayek's son and daughter. And they had to meet me, and we both had to agree that this would be a good arrangement. So, and I also knew I had to try to find some funding. So I thought, Montpelier Society. I'll go to the first meeting, see if I can meet some rich Hayek lovers at the Montpelier Society meeting. And yeah, I went in there totally naive. I didn't know how to raise money. I was horrible at it, and just moron really walking into this meeting. But in terms of meeting the family, I took a train down to Devon. Larry Hayek, the son, younger of the 2 siblings, picked me up, took me to his house. Sitting there at the kitchen table was Christine Hayek. We talked for like 2 or 3 hours. It was wonderful. I was so stupid. I didn't take notes. I did not take notes. But I just had this great conversation with her. She left. They had me for dinner. In the afternoon, Larry took me up to his study. He said, "Yeah, you should poke around in here tomorrow, but let me just show you some things." He showed. It was amazing stuff that was in there. All sorts of family memorabilia, pictures, and things like that. But bizarre stuff. Hayek's, when he was 16 years old, he would accompany his father on flora expeditions in the mountains, and he took pictures of orchids and labeled them with the Latin names. I mean, it's just bizarre stuff, very strange stuff. Maps that I thought were alpining maps, and it was actually maps from World War I when he was at the front, all sorts of battle maps, basically. So, and Larry held up this little blue folder and he said, and this stuff is pretty delicate. And I look at it, it's a divorce file. I didn't know anything about the divorce. Here's all the papers on Hayek's divorce. So I mean, I just think, Jesus, this is amazing stuff. They're very welcoming. So I did, I explored all that, and it really made me realize that I've been working on this guy for, at that point, 15 to 20 years. I knew nothing about him. I knew nothing about his family. He was a disembodied essence that had, and I realized this is a person with a story. It's a real person. So that made me want to at least learn more. So I took on the collected works bit. And then about a decade ago, when it looked like things were kind of winding up, I could have quit again. By all rights, I should have, because although whoever was the general editor was supposed to do a biography, Hayek had always said, if you do a biography of me, the biographer has to speak German, and that's something I don't do. Okay, I don't know. I took a semester of German in college when I first started to think. As an adult, when I was 40 at UNCG, just because I thought, well, if I'm learning about Hayek, I should know some German. I thought, this is a fool's mission. I'm never going to learn enough German to do this. But as editor of the collected works, 2 of the volumes were done by Hans-Jörg Klassing. And unlike many of the other editors of the collected works, he was a dream to work with. He did great introductions. He knew the areas of Hayek's work that I knew the least about, the monetary stuff. He got all his work done in time, on time, okay? Not everyone did that. And just as I said, wonderful to work with. So I said, geez, yeah, if I'm going to do this biography, would you join me? And he said yes. And I was the happiest guy on the planet, and it's been a wonderful collaboration. It was not always easy. I'll talk about that in a second. But it was a very worthwhile endeavor to work on such a large project with another human being. So anyway, I'll stop there. That's why. That's how I did 35 years of Hayek and accounting. As I said, there's one last part. There's one last thing that made me attracted to doing Hayek. As I said, early on, I was interested in this methodology, but I can remember in England, where Hayek is associated with Thatcher, and most academics don't like Thatcher, so they don't like Hayek. Okay, I mean, simple enough. And I was presenting a talk on his methodology, Fred Lee was in the audience, and he stood up and he reamed me. Oh man, he went on for like 2 or 3 minutes. There's a Hayek's wrong on this, Hayek's wrong on this, Hayek's blah, 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 blah. All not stuff on methodology, just Hayek. And I was just like, well, my response was inadequate. I said, I know you're trying to bait me, and I'm here to talk about his methodology. So you can think whatever you want, but I'm not going to try to address all this. But that was inadequate as an answer then and now. And it made me realize that this is a guy who generates a lot of passion, people who love him, people who hate him, and lots of extreme visceral responses. And I've probably given 100 talks about Hayek, and you never know what's going to be out there in the audience, where the next shot's going to be coming from. So that was attractive to me. Not initially. Initially, it was quite disturbing. But after a while, it made me think, this is a guy who's, you're probably in the best position to tell the story of this guy, given how controversial he is. Not that I am as much of a saint as I was portrayed by Scott, but I am trying to figure out what the guy was doing at various points in his career, academically, in his life, and all the rest. So anyway, I'll finish that part there. I have no time left, so sorry. Okay, I'll move very quickly to the other stuff. So as I said, doing co-authored work is tough. You've got to first of all account for the fact that people have different writing styles and writing habits, and we just did the usual sensible thing. We divvied it up, and he did the bit that he would know best about, which would be the Vienna period, and I would do more of the stuff when I was in England. And then as we finished the work chapters, we would exchange them. So we got kind of a manuscript that had what we would call it at the Duke workshop, the data dump. We had all the information, but we didn't know how we were going to shape it. Okay, and we then had a wonderful manuscript conference that Pete Becky at GMU put together for 2 days, like 15 people. They'd read the whole thing and worked through it bit by bit, and trying to figure out, what is the narrative arc for this section? What is going on with this? What's the really important part here? Why is this stuff in here? It doesn't seem to fit. That was extremely helpful. And we worked and massaged after that the manuscript quite a bit. And the final thing that happened, and if this happens to you, you might initially want to resist it. You'll think in your head, but don't. The editor at Chicago said, cut it by 10%. And we said, what? Man, that's painful. But in doing that, we really tightened up the arguments. We made the prose a lot clearer. We got rid of superfluous stuff that we liked, but wasn't really central to the arguments. And it really was a helpful thing. So that was the process that we went through. Let me talk a little bit about the sources. Okay, the sources were there's 2 main sources that were already out there. The Hayek Archives, obviously itself, but then there was a transcript in 1978, 500-page transcript. I have an original copy way back when, and now it's online, of interviews by very prominent people of Hayek. But what made it sensible to do the biographies that we got a lot more additional information. First of all, Bill Bartley, who was going to be both Hayek and Popper's biographer, did interviews. And he had copies of these interviews that he gave to me. And then Larry Hayek, when I visited with them, gave me something called the inductive basis, which is a kind of play on words. If you're a Popperian scholar, you'll understand what it means. But it was partly summary of some of the things that he had learned about Hayek in various discussions that he's had with him. So he had those two pieces. Then the materials that I got from the Hayek family, there was all sorts of bizarre stuff, and all this stuff has now been deposited, by the way, at Hoover. The Hoover collection is now, it's 200 boxes. They said, okay, you can have it, and then when you're done with it, pass it on to Hoover, so it's all there now. I don't know if it's archived yet or cataloged yet, but it's there. But bizarre stuff. So his mother kept a little Fritz Earl's Tagebuch. It's as if Fritz the baby, when he's born, is saying, here's what happened day to day. Okay, so it's his mom doing this little strange little exercise, right? Which is, so you learn a little bit about what he was like as a baby. But in the back of that, when World War I started, Fritz himself started to write up things about his views of what was going on with the world at that point. He had some diary. He had a diary that he kept at the early part of when he was made it to the front. Okay, so while he was on the Italian front, he kept lists of books that he had read while he was at university, but he also interspersed in these lists his reactions to various professors that he had. So there's all sorts of stuff that was spread out all over the place in the archives they're now in the archives, but stuff that the family had given us. And then of course there was the family correspondence, and they said, here, you can have all of the correspondence. And I thought, Jesus, it's gonna be wonderful. And then we realized that with rare exceptions, most of the correspondence was not by Hayek. It was by his family members. Now, if you think about that, that's probably not that unusual. I mean, you don't write to your wife all the time. And therefore you learn about the relationship by all your letters because you're living together. So there's elements of that are not unusual, but it's also the fact that he went through two things. He went through a divorce. So I think some things just were thrown out by his family members that just like, geez, forget about that guy. So there may have been some things that didn't make it into it. But also during the 1930s, his entire birth family was living in either Austria or Germany. And he was becoming a more famous liberal in England, okay? So you've got family members in Hitler's Germany, in Austria during Patriotic Front days, and then later after the Anschluss, so it becomes part of Germany. And you got to be careful about having letters from some guy who's in England. So a lot of the letters from there, all of his letters were destroyed. But we do have their writings to him. And it really, I'll say in a second, that was a very significant part of the collection that we got. But finally, there were the interviews of the family members, and we went beyond the family members. I talked to Lionel Robbins' daughter Ann about their relationship because they were all close. Larry was probably would have been the best person, and I had 2 or 3 conversations with him. But the last time I saw him was in 2004 at a conference at Cambridge, put on by Emma Rothschild. Marcia Sen was there, Vernon Smith was there, Magna Bissay, and Larry was there, others. And he was so full of life. This was just a wonderful, full personality guy. He had been a student at King's. So at the end of the conference, he said, let's go up to the roof. So we went to the top of King's Cathedral, and you've got all these academics there. We were, I was just like this, just really afraid of falling off the roof of this thing and dying. And he's just running up and down the roof like he was still a college kid. It was great. 6 weeks later, he was dead of a heart attack, and just was gone. So never got to talk to him. But I talked to Christine over and over and over again. I think I have about 15 hours worth of interviews with her. She was just a biographer's dream because she was straightforward. She was hilarious. She was really smart. honest about everything, talked about her own biases, says, talks about Mrs. Hayek too, as she referred to her. I hate the woman. I hate the woman. I mean, vile person. I mean, she's just great. And we had conversations in her flat in Chiswick, and we would have a conversation in the morning, and we'd go to the pub and have a pub lunch. We took a train down to Devon. The best one was I hired a car and we went to the neighborhood that she grew up in on Turner Close in Hampstead Garden suburb, and she walked around and brought back all those memories. Oh yeah, these trees are bigger because we used to be able to see the clock of that church when we were playing out here, so we'd know when it was 6 o'clock. I mean, it was great. And again, it was really getting a sense of the family, and that's important in a biography, really important. So let me tell you some of the stuff that I learned. Okay. So I say I learned. I mean, Hans Jorgen was like Sherlock Holmes in his investigative abilities. He was marvelous. He got Hayek's grammar school records. Okay, he knew which schools he went to, what grades he got, et cetera, et cetera. So just to give you kind of big pictures, I should say, so Hayek's born in 1899. He lives in Vienna, fights in World War I on the Italian front, goes to the University of Vienna, finishes up, spends 15 months in New York on a New York trip, meets Wesley Clare Mitchell and J.B. Clark and others. Comes back, works in Vienna for a while, gets invited to the London School of Economics to give lectures, prices, and production. This led to a job offer. He becomes a professor there, moves his family to London. 1930s, very fraught time. He's in London, joins Lionel Robbins' grand seminar. World War II begins. LSE evacuates to Cambridge. The war is over. He writes The Road to Serfdom there. The war is over. They return. He founds the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947. September 46, he finally gets to visit Vienna, more than a year after the war is over, and sees the person that he wished he had married and decides that he's going to, and they decide that. So the next 3 or 4 years is then figuring out how to do that, and he ends up divorcing his first wife, leaving his family, marrying his third cousin, moving to the University of Chicago. And that's where we stop, volume 1. Everything after that is going to be volume 2. So about the youth period, that Vienna period. I think of Vienna as a city, a real city, but it was tiny. The world that, of course, he's a kid, so your world is circumscribed anyway. But really, it was a very circumscribed and tiny world. His father his passion was botany, and he was a plant geographer, so he spent a lot of time out in the field trying to figure out what plants are associated with what particular regions. And a lot of Hayek's education came through these family outings. But everything revolved around the family. Because his father in his day job was a district physician, whenever he moved up in the ranks to another district, they would have to switch houses. So he was changing schools. I think he went to 4 different schools. And sometimes it was because of the father having to move. Other times it was that he got in trouble with school. And I said, "Got to go to it." He was not a good student. He was not a good student. He was bored senseless, is what it looked like. And he said, "Yeah, I would frustrate the heck out of the professors or teachers because I had obvious skills and I was lazy and I just wouldn't apply myself." And so at one point he actually had to repeat a grade. This is, if you've read about the Austrian school system by people like Stefan Zweig, I think that's pronounced right, I'm not sure, Zweig or Zweig, whatever, or Karl Popper or others, they report the same sort of thing, that it was really not a school system that would encourage independent thought or creativity in any manner. So he didn't do well at school, and he only hung out he didn't have friends from these school instances. his only close friend was his mother's best friend's son, Walter Mott. That was his only real friend. Everything else just revolved around doing stuff with the family. The family was an extended family, and he had two younger brothers, but he didn't hang out with them much. He was always hanging out with the adults. He was kind of like Keynes in that way, you know, he was just kind of separated from the other younger kids. And a bit of a loner, very independent, obviously, given his actions in school. And he didn't know girls. And this is going to become really important given his relationships, because yeah, he had his mother. That was the only girl he knew, was his mother. And then his cousin, his third cousin, who he ends up marrying as his second wife, who they used to do dancing lessons and go ice skate, but that was it. So it was a strange, I mean, from typical American type of background, it just seemed like a very kind of constricted life, and not unenjoyable, but certainly different from what many people are used to. So he fights in the war. He goes to the Italian front. As a typical American, I think of World War I as the Western Front. Had no idea that there was 1 million people died on the front between Italy and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He arrives at the right after just to give you a sense, the 12th battle of the Isonzo. So this is a river, and they just kept going back and forth 12 times. And finally, this was an initiative that pushed up to the river Piave, and that's where he was stationed during World War I. And basically, the sense you get is that he was, again, bored senseless, because you're just sitting there. The Austro-Hungarian army was happy with the advance that they had made, because they got a lot of more food and other materials from the new territory that they'd taken over. But the Italian front, they were not going to let them get beyond the Piave, because after that would open up all of Italy. So they were being reinforced by British materials from Americans, etc. So they were just sat there pretty much till the end of the war. So he did have some harrowing experiences, but the worst thing that happened was he described himself as a loner. He said, "I've only had 3 friends in my life. One of them, Walter Mott, second will soon meet Herbert Firth, and the third, Lionel Robbins." Walter Mott gets dysentery and dies. And he could have visited him because he was on the way to the front, but they were in a hurry to get to the front, and then he found out a letter and he realized he could have visited. He was haunted by that for the rest of his life. His secretary said that at one point he saw the picture of Walter Mott, and his voice just caught, and he kind of turned it away so she wouldn't see his emotions. So it was a real loss through that. So the war's over, and he gets back to Vienna, enters the University of Vienna. We, as I said, talk a lot about that period. Some of the things that we should probably just get to this point. Yeah. Something that I knew about, but I was pressed to learn so much more about, was the varieties of anti-Semitism that existed in Europe, Western Europe, and Central Europe as well. Through this period, now, of course, it's always existed in Europe, but particularly from the 1870s onwards, in the United States as well. Just the varieties of anti-Semitism that were out there. When I say varieties of it, I think of anti-Semitism, somebody doesn't like Jewish people. Now, there was racial anti-Semitism, because there was the scientific racism, these distinct races. This was one aspect that was going on in academic circles. There was religious anti-Semitism by people who were, you're a Catholic, this is the person who killed Christ, you're the parish priest in a small village, you get the kind of anti-Semitism that comes from that sort of thing. You had cultural anti-Semitism that was often aimed at the Ostjuden, the people who were escaping pogroms in Silesia, or parts of what is now Poland and Russia, who are they speak Yiddish, they're Orthodox, they dress funny. You know, you're an acculturated German Jew in Vienna, and you might not even be Jewish anymore. You might have converted to Lutheranism, for example. And you know, these are, even you might say, you know, these are not my people. Okay, so there's that kind of. And then of course there's economic anti-Semitism. Yeah, people who are competing against people in the medical profession. You're closed out of a lot of professions, so there's a lot of Jewish doctors. So German doctors who are not Jewish are saying, Austrian doctors who are not Jewish. You know, these people are invading our profession. So there's all these elements of anti-Semitism that are there, and they're exacerbated by the extension of this franchise, bizarrely. Okay, so what ended up happening, as happened in many countries, with the expansion of the franchise, is that mass parties started to form, and there were three major parties at this point in time in Austria, and each one of them had elements of anti-Semitism associated with it. So there was the various German parties who were saying we want to either join with Germany, Greater Germany, or want to emphasize the German aspects of our society, and they often had Aryan paragraphs. So you can be a member of the party but not of the Jewish. And then there was the Christian socials who would have kind of that element of the religious anti-Semitism, but also there was a lot. This is the party that represented the small shopkeepers who were being challenged economically by peddlers and all the rest. So kind of the working man. And then finally there was the socialists who were the least anti-Semitic, but they would use tropes occasionally, like, well, capitalism and Jews, you know, that sort of thing. Merchant of Venice, sorts of elements. So Hayek tried to form with his new friend, Herbert Firth, that he meets when he goes to university, a student organization that's affiliated with a party that ran in the elections of 1919 and then disappeared. But their whole point was, we're going to oppose elements of the three mass parties. We're going to have something that's really quite different. So instead of being socialist, okay, you're going to be reform liberal, okay? Basically Fabian socialism, not full socialism of the Marxist sort, Austro-Marxist sort. You're going to embrace German culture, but not be racist in terms of anti-Semitic. And you're going to be democratic. They supported universal male-female suffrage as opposed to monarchy or elements of authoritarian government instead. So this is the values that they embraced early on. This was interesting to me because these are many of the ideas that Hayek would embrace later. He actually had early on in terms of the friendship with Firth. But what was more important about the friendship with Firth than that is that Firth is Lutheran, but he's Jewish in descent. And the anti-Semitism that I mentioned that was rife in society, it also affected Hayek's own birth family. His father was the head of a German medical association that had an Aryan paragraph in it. His mother, in some of her letters, would go on about Jews. We were in the mountains and our vacation was ruined because of people showed up who were having conversations in the restaurant. And so he made friends with Firth. This became his second of his three best friends. And he joined the Geistkreis, which is almost exclusively Jewish students. And he basically discovers the Jewish intelligentsia in Vienna that he had been kept from in this way he was raised by his birth family. And it caused tension. I mean, Firth reported later that Hayek's mother would never talk to him, blamed Firth for turning Hayek into a liberal. All these, he's a good conservative, Austrian family. What's he doing with these strange ideas, hanging out with these strange people? So she was quite unhappy with that. Anyway, this was a moment that I went on about for a long time because I was raised in kind of a similar sort of environment and had a similar sort of reaction. My father was born in 1911 in Georgia, So middle of Jim Crow period. And he was a wonderful guy, loved everybody loved him. Brother said, you know, give you a shirt off his back. But he used the N-word, that was the word he used. That was the word he used. That's the word I grew up hearing whenever my father referred to black. And my mother was the daughter of Polish immigrants from Brooklyn, New York, and brought up in a ethnic, kind of ghetto. And she had a slur word for every ethnic group that existed. I mean, I knew every one of those words. And people who are my generation, that may have been more common back then, I don't know. But when I became an adult, I realized just what a poisonous thing that was, and reacted against it. Told them, when they come to visit as grandma and grandpa, that words better never escape their lips, so they're not going to be welcome. But that's, the description that we use in the book is everyday anti-Semitism. And it's not the Hitler racial, I want to kill Jews type of thing, but it's just this casual, horrible way of being that was something that was part of his life that he reacted to. And I found it to be something that was inspiring to me. Now, it makes it sound like he's somewhat cosmopolitan, but then he goes to New York and he absolutely hates his New York experience in 1923-24. He shows up in New York in the middle of the 20s. This is a building boom is going on. It's loud, it's big, it's noisy. He hates American culture. The radios are blaring everywhere. They're not playing opera, they're playing pop music. This could have been such a wonderful invention, and these Americans screw it all up. All they ever talk about is money. It was the standard European reaction to all things American. Okay, the things that people laugh about today and don't characterize people as today. The most entertaining part. This is a fun chapter to write because the most entertaining part was his reaction to women. Again, he's got this strange relationship with women. Painted, they're painted, okay? Because this is when mascara and lipstick first started to appear on public streets. And the worst thing is, you can't tell people's class by how they dress. You cannot tell people's class by how they dress. The horror. Okay, what kind of society is this? Okay, so I mean, it was entertaining to see that reaction. It was also an important trip because he spent a lot of time in the public library. He attended Mitchell's class and Clark's class, but he spent a lot of time in the public library reading about World War I and British authors. And he realized that, first of all, he discovered the British liberal tradition. So by the time he goes to England, he's perfectly comfortable there because it was a place he had read about. And also he realized that the stuff that he learned about the various countries during the war were just propaganda, wrong. And it made him think, you really have to have experiences yourself, but also it's a responsibility of newspapers to try to more accurately depict what's going on. So he had a proposal for an international newspaper page that would somehow try to filter information so that people would have a better idea of what was true. I'm going to not move more quickly, but because I am almost to my end. So anyway, he comes back, and the significant bit about the New York trip was, I think because he was had so little contact with women, he just had a horrible miscommunication with his third cousin. In fact, there was no communication before he left, it looked like. And so she married somebody and had a kid. And he got back, and then they had a conversation. They both realized that this was a horrible mistake, okay? That they should have married each other. It's too late now. So his solution is to marry somebody who looks just like him, okay? And that's his first wife, Ella. And that went on for a while. But that was how we dealt with it. He took a job, got invited to LSE, and he and Ella and the family moved to England. I won't talk too much about the London School of Economics experience because it's pretty well known. The one thing I learned was his teaching style was something that I'd seen him in interviews, but basically everyone who interacted with him said that he was polite, tolerant, serious-minded, more or less quiet. I mean, they talked about the Robbins Grand Seminar. One person joked that whoever the speaker was would speak for 15 minutes. The rest of the people would speak for 15 minutes, and then Nikki Caldwell would speak for an hour. Basically, there were people who were very aggressive in the seminar, and Hayek was not one of these. He was just kind of very low key. And I say tolerant because, I mean, Scheall started a dissertation under him. This guy saw the Keynesian light, switched to Keynes. Hayek said, no problem. Okay, no problem with that. That's what you're following. He invited Robert Bryce down, who was a research student at Cambridge, to give 4 lectures in his own seminar about the Keynesian approach. So he was interested in the exchange of ideas. I thought that was admirable. And it was also clear in the correspondence with Robbins just how close he was to Robbins during this period. They met in early 30s, and in the first exchange of letters, it looked like these were 2 friends who had known each other for 20 years. That's how intimate they immediately were. We do have chapters about their life on Turner Close that I got from Christine. And it was a very kind of traditional, old-fashioned sort of family. Christine's line that she would use over and over again was, I barely knew the man, because I was a little kid and he was teaching at LSE. They repeated classes in the afternoon and the evening. So 3 to 4 nights a week, he wouldn't even be home. When he was home, they were supposed to be quiet. He was the prof in the study, is another phrase that she used. And her mother did everything, and I mean everything. He used to joke that he'd never seen the inside of his own kitchen. So it was to that extent that he was just pursuing his own work, and she was taking care of the family. The couple of things that I'll close with is the fraught relationship that he had with his birth family, who were in Germany and Austria during the 1930s. So Weier's 2 younger brothers in Germany, they couldn't find a job. This was when the Great Depression hit. Austria was in bad shape in the 20s and was in worse shape in the 30s. And Germany, actually under Hitler, that was one of the things he was trying to do, was generate more jobs. So they went there and found work. And one brother, just as kind of we don't know much about Eric. He didn't seem to be particularly political or anything like that. But the other one was much more like the mother, Hayek's mother. He joined the Roundtrust, the SA, in 1933. Now he was an anatomist, and that was a state appointment. And he was from a different country working in Germany, so he was kind of going with the flow. There was a woman who did a wonderful book called The Anatomy of Murder, looking at that profession of German anatomists and what they did during the 30s and 40s. She characterized Hayek, his brother, as a pragmatist. That was somebody who became a party member as a result of just trying to keep a job, okay, as opposed to being a fervent believer. But he stayed in Germany through 35. He then went to Shanghai, of all places, to work. Before he returned to Germany, it appears that he was, at this point, known to be Hayek's brother. So that's one reason that we think this happened. He claimed in his denazification trial that someone had accused him of being a suspect, but he joined the Nazi Party in 1938 before he returned to Germany. And he worked in Germany during the war, and then at the end of the war, lost his position, had to go through this denazification trial, and made it through. I mean, he was charged as a fellow traveler, which is the least sort of charge he could make, and was found guilty of that, and a fine was imposed. He appealed it, got rid of the fine, but the sentence remained. But that, going through that process, allowed him to then become a professor again. He was a professor in the 30s and then got a position in Vienna in 1950. So anyway, that was the situation. But what we focused on was the correspondence. Now, again, we didn't have Hayek's letters, but it's clear that Hayek is chastising his brother in the 30s because the letters back from the brother is, how can you say these things? And blah, blah, blah. And no, you're wrong about this. No, you're wrong about that. So it looks like they're having quite a back and forth about this in the 30s. The same sort of thing is going on with the correspondence with the mother. And it's painful to read some of that stuff, I have to say. But again, it also as soon as the Anschluss took place, Hayek became a British citizen along with the rest of his family. And yeah, I knew that happened in 1938, but I did not realize until you read this correspondence, this was a real break. It's a real declaration of change. And after that, Hans-Jörg, again, doing his good detective work, found out that the Gestapo had put in a stop that if he ever showed up in Vienna, Friedrich Hayek showed up in Vienna again, that they were to grab him. Okay. So it was a step that was an important step in that thing. It also makes some of the stuff they wrote to serfdom all that more poignant when you talk about how the horse get on top and all this. Okay, the post-war period, Montpellier Society, and then there's the divorce. We go into detail on the divorce. I can talk about anything you want at this point. What I'll just say about, yesterday, Jeff Hodgson, that was a wonderful presentation about him, and he said, what do you do in a biography? You don't want to do all this sensitive stuff. And there's a decision we had to make. How much do you go into detail about something that's so personal? Well, it was such a central event in his life, but it also seemed that he wanted his biographers to talk about it. Larry Hayek held up that folder the very first day I met him, and inside the folder there were transcriptions of letters that Hayek had sent to his wife that had been typed up. So he had sent handwritten letters that he then typed up what he had sent and left it in this folder. So I think he wanted that story told. There were elements of it that had been mistold before that we wanted to deal with. So we did go into the details of that, and that was the diciest decision we had to make. And I don't know. I guess every biographer does it differently. Now, the one thing that I did do that I think is probably some biographers, students of biography would be suspect, is I got too close to Christine Hayek. I really valued the information she gave me. She's a wonderful person, and I was so looking forward to her reading the book, and she died. She just died in January 2nd. So I didn't get that chance, but so that's all like that. Thank you for being patient and let me talk about myself. Let me talk about Hayek. Let's talk about whatever we want to talk. Thanks. So I don't know how to do this. Does Scott do something?
Can you play MC?
Do I need a microphone?
Are there people from remote who sent in things to the webinar? That was something that
on the chat.
Yeah, so I don't know how to access any of that stuff because I'm Luddite.
Don't seem to be any questions on the chat, but if anybody wants to ask questions on the Zoom, feel free to post your questions on the chat. If there's anybody in the room, yes, Bert, go ahead.
So thanks so much, Bruce. That was really great to hear that. I mean, really interesting. When you said you didn't speak German,
yeah,
it made me think of myself. I was born in Cuba and I learned English in first grade, and it was a shock. And so I'm curious about Hayek and his acquisition of English. What happened there? Was it hard for him? Is there any discussion of this? How did it affect him?
yes. So a couple of episodes that I can recount about Hayek's use of English. If you've seen interviews, he speaks English well enough with an accent, obviously. But so before he went to New York, he took a Berlitz course in English to try to understand English better. And so he learned English to some extent while he's in New York. And then when he moved to England, when he first gave his lectures on prices and production, people told him afterwards that no one could understand what he was saying when he read his lectures. So there was that problem. And there were students who were reporting on Hayek in the classroom. One of them made the comment, we couldn't tell if he was speaking German with an English accent or English with a German accent. So, I mean, yeah, I think he had obvious communication problems early on. And he did, to his credit, say to Lionel Robbins, look, I think it would be better not to put me into lecture classes in the first few years, and instead put me in classes with upper level people who are research students where we can have conversations. Because people who talked about the crisis of production episode also said that he was much more coherent and understandable when he would respond to questions. But when he was just simply reading, they couldn't get it. So, I mean, it was a gradual process for sure.
Thank you for your wonderful explanation. There's so much European history in it, in understanding of Hayek. And so I'm just wondering, most of it, the way you explained it, it's through the letters and talking with the family. But how did you get access, apart from him or family, towards this very complicated, I think, European history in the 1920s, 30s, 40s?
Yeah.
Very good for Europeans to understand. So how did you get access or an understanding of that?
So having the co-author was what allowed that to happen. And both of us did a lot of reading of general history, I suppose. Each episode, each chapter is a specific episode, so you read up on that particular era. But I mean, Hans Jorgen carried the heavy weight in terms of the European history aspects of it, of the story. So it was his good labors that allowed us to talk about that stuff. And he, yeah, I learned a huge amount from him in the process. So it's more the personal stuff that I mean, the interviews were good for understanding more about the personal relationships, but yes, we are trying to put all of that in the context of the period he's living in and the various places he was living in at the time. The New York chapter was so much fun to do for me. I mean, learning about these painted women in the 20s. Great.
Thank you very much. I really enjoy the way you presented biography in progress, and it's really well done. I have a couple of questions related to his teaching at the NSE. The sources that I see, one is the letter from Ursula to John Hicks, which I edited, and they all agree, and then Sue Olson biography of Brian Robbins, and then Caldwell's own reminiscences. They all point out how, uninspiring teacher he seems to have been. I just wonder whether you think this was due to his personality trait, not being able to communicate, to be persuasive. How much it was due to the way in which teaching was performed those days. So this is my first question. And by the way, it's interesting that when Richard Kahn went to the United States, then
He had the same reaction.
the same reaction,
Yeah.
the food and the way in which was 10 years later, though, okay? But same reaction. And by the way, Kahn was an uninspiring teacher as well. So the connection. So it's a generation, the shyness. How do you make out? This is my first question. Second question, I was curious about this book collecting passion, which again is something that he had in common with Keynes, and that was the basis of his own communication, even with Rafa.
Rafa as well.
Yeah. So again, this book collection, did he end up with them moving around as he did? did you may end up by having a huge library, or what happens to the book collecting thing?
Two great questions. So, I mean, in terms of his, compared to Lionel Robbins, who students would describe as someone who would just capture a room with his lectures and his long hair flowing, dramatic gestures. Like, it's very low key, and I think it's partly his personality. He also never talked down to students or people who heard his talks. I mean, I heard a lecture that he gave on tape at the Institute for Humane Studies. And yeah, I was thinking the audience, they would not have understood anything he was talking about because he didn't articulate well, but he was also assumed a knowledge that they would not have had. And so I think we have a note in von Morgenstern's diary talking about Hayek's first teaching experiences in German. And he was saying the same thing. He's incomprehensible. He's incomprehensible. So I don't think it was simply a matter of trying to express yourself in another language. I think that he did not always communicate that well. So I think that's as far as I can go there. The second question was about, I'm sorry, I didn't write it down.
Book collecting.
Oh, the book collecting, yeah. So he did collect books all the time. When he went to give the LSE lectures, he took a side trip to Edinburgh where they had lots of books for sale, cheap, and bought a bunch. So he was collecting throughout his life. And he financed the purchase of his house on Turner Close in the late 30s. They moved from a place they were renting to a place that they bought by selling his book collection. And he did, he would occasionally just sell off the books and use the money for whatever purpose he needed to do. He did that later too. He also lost a lot of books in the divorce. He basically left them there. I think they were, he brought some of them with him, but it's hard when you're talking about an international move.
So it is likely that book annotated by him ended up in various places, and it can't have something really substantial.
Yeah, so he didn't annotate his books. His particular way of studying, he didn't keep notes, and he didn't annotate the books. There was his kind of penguin edition of the Wealth of Nations. There was an auction of Hayek's memorabilia that Sotheby's put on. I have a picture of myself holding his Nobel Prize, which I didn't buy, but whoever did spend over £1 million for it. And this little kind of crummy edition of the Wealth of Nations, Hayek's edition of the Wealth of Nations, sold for a very large amount. But I saw there's nothing in it. There was no notes. He didn't take notes. He just read and thought, and sometimes he'd have note cards, but that was for like significant passages that he wanted to go back to in the page number, but not any kind of systematic notation. And he remarks on this. He says, sometimes I go back and read something I've read before, and see a whole bunch of stuff I didn't see the first time. So his particular, he was not a systematic sort of thing. And he acknowledged that.
Question from Jim, and then a question down here. We've got a couple of questions on the chat, so let's try to take them.
Okay, Bruce, thank you for this. I found it really interesting and fascinating. And the only little bit of interest I've had in Hayek is the Century Order. So that came out in the early 50s, and I imagine it was something that formulated in this period you were writing about. So could you maybe talk about how that fits in with your interest in methodology? Why are you interested in Hayek? And we got this really unusual book, The Sensory Order, I think in 51 or 52.
Yeah, so The Sensory Order is a book on theoretical psychology published in 1952 that actually found its origin in a paper he had done when he was a student in 1920 that was never published. The student manuscript is translated and published in the collected works edition of the Century Order that was edited by Victor Vanberg, and he wrote a very nice editor's introduction for that as well. This was something that, his early interest at university was in philosophy and in psychology. And then only later did he turn to economics. We have a very detailed chapter on those transitions, and also what parts of that early work show up in the later work. But he turned back to it in 1945 when Otto Neurath had written him a letter kind of challenging some of the stuff that he had argued about in the scientism essay, felt that Hayek had mischaracterized logical empiricism, was defending it and wanted to have a debate with it. And it was in, I think, thinking that he was going to respond at some point to Neurath, that he turned back to this essay. And we also show how, if Hayek's right about the psychology, that would be an argument that he could make against Neurath's physicalism. So it was something that he started early on. And to read this stuff that he was writing as a student, it's pretty impressive. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, obviously, but I had to read it quite a few times to kind of get it. And again, this is how so I'll just read it a few times.
I will say that Vanberg's introduction to the 52 Century Order is fantastic. If you're not familiar, please check it out. And also, there's a Cosmos and Taxes Symposium Walter Weimer that Bill Blutos. Anyway, go ahead, sir.
Thanks. Thank you for a very interesting presentation, of course, a large work on Hayek. And it's just to add what Christina said, Scheall had a very wonderful experience with him. He has a very nice guy that you've probably seen in the MC archive, saying how gracious he was that he was allowed to change the games. I wanted to ask you, and in fact, he led me. He didn't find it comprehensive, he found it difficult. So he had a different experience than some of the others. I wanted to ask you, how do you deal with the issue of his relation with economic policy? Because I think Hayek, in some ways, was much more careful than he's portrayed to be in a lot of his correspondence, stuff that I read. He was much more careful when it came to questions of economic policy than some of the later people who followed him were. So if you have some thoughts on that, thanks. I'm thinking that also some correspondence with Rob yet, but.
So I deal more with some of this in the, there's another book that has already just come out this year. Mont Pelerin 1947, transcripts of the founding meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society, because that society is viewed as the source of all things neoliberalism, and that first meeting, in my view, is often misrepresented what went on at the meeting. So I wanted to just have the transcript of that meeting available. It's available to scholars who go to Hoover, but not everyone's going to do that. So, in terms of policy, other people at the Mont Pelerin Society were much more involved directly with making recommendations about policy. Rupke was one of them. Rupke and Eucken both came up with policy recommendations that ended up being the very ones that were followed in 1948 that started the so-called German miracle of getting rid of the price controls and reforming the currency. Hayek would talk more obliquely about policy, and this is true throughout his career. Even in the Constitution of Liberty, the last third of it has chapters devoted to various policy sorts of issues, but he is always looking for what are the liberal principles that would underlie particular policy viewpoints. Whereas someone like a Milton Friedman would say, what are the policies that we want to undertake? And I think that difference is very much there, and always was.
Let's some of these questions in the chat here. Paul Dudenheffer says, no question, but greetings from the Hope Center. Enjoyed the talk very much. I forgot to mention in my introduction, one of the best things about Bruce is bringing Paul Dudenheffer into our world. So that's a Morrow asks, hi Bruce, many congratulations on your DF award. I'd like to ask you whether Hayek paid attention to the ideas of this fellow Austrian Sigmund Freud in the interwar period. I wonder whether he shared Keynes's interest in Freudian psychology.
Wonderful question, Mauro. Thank you so much for that one. Hayek detested Freud. He comes to LSE and everybody is fawning over Freudian ideas and know he's from Vienna. So they say, so do you know Freud? This is what he kept getting over and over and over. And he was like, and he knew of Freud's work, but was not impressed. Hayek writes The Sensory Order, which he thinks is a scientific approach to psychology. Freud is all about this untestable, id and ego is driving everything. How do you know? Whoa, we know. Okay, and there's nothing, So he viewed it as kind of, I wouldn't say he viewed him as a sham, but he was not impressed with Freudian psychology. And then Freud goes to London in the late 30s to escape Central Europe. Many of his relatives didn't escape. And he dies there, maybe a year after he gets there from a long-standing illness, jaw cancer, I think. But while he's there, he is just feted as a celebrity. I mean, Dolly went and painted a caricature of him. He gets visited by the Royal Academy. I mean, they had to change the train that Freud came into London to a different one because there was this massive crowd of people who were waiting for the arrival of his train. So he just had, and Freud came to LSE to be fawned over, in Hayek's view, by people there, and Hayek just didn't even try to meet him. He just turned around and left. So yes, he knew about Freud. He didn't, he thought that he was not that great a psychologist.
Wade Hands asks, hi Bruce, great presentation. I was wondering if digging into the personal side for the bio, did you uncover anything that would make you change your mind about your earlier work on Hayek and Popper or Hayek on methodology?
Jesus. Thanks a lot, Wade. I have to really think about that. So I first of all, I have to think about what I might have written in my early work about Hayek and Popper, and then whether something changed. Let's just say nothing changed. Everything I said before was right.
You were always kind of under the opinion that the influence was more from Hayek to Popper than Popper to Hayek, or that the notion that Hayek became a Popperian was dubious because there's a sharing of.
I mean, actually, so I can say that there wasn't any change. I thought they both influenced each other to some extent, and we talk a little bit about to what extent. But my earliest work, I had not read the correspondence between the two of them, but there was a Vienna meeting on the 100th anniversary of Popper's birth in the early 2000s, where I wrote a paper that said Hayek and Popper, who influenced whom, and what I said there is what is still in the biography now. So, but if you mean early, if you get to 2000, that's when the narrative that I portray stabilized. Let's put it there.
We have a rather pointed question from Alexandre. I can't read the last name here, but Alexandre asks, do you believe that from a purely technical point of view, Hayek's contributions were important enough to justify his Nobel Prize?
So that is a good question. He was awarded the Nobel Prize together with Gunnar Myrdal, and neither one of them was particularly happy about the receipt by the other person of the prize. And Myrdal made it actually, when Friedman got his prize, that's when Myrdal started to talk about how the prize had been degraded by being awarded to others. Now, what they mention in the prize is his early contributions to monetary theory. And then they talk about his broader contributions to social science. And they did similar things for Myrdal. And for me, the technical contributions that Hayek made were not along those lines. It was more along the stuff that you would find in the use of knowledge in society, which I think has had a profound effect on the economics profession. We have Nick Carr here, who I think also argue that Hayek had an impact on the economics profession. But then again, he was not a technically trained economist. So when you say technical, I'm not sure what that means. You know, if you think that economics is supposed to be something that is mathematical, he wasn't doing that. And on his own admission, the pure theory of capital was not something that, he felt that he hadn't completed that project, and so I wouldn't say he thought it a failure, but it was something that he ended up not working on. So that would be another one of his technical contributions that would not be.
We've got 5 minutes. There are a couple of questions on the chat, but I thought I would open it up to the room again to see if there's anybody. Oh, hey, cool.
That was great, Bruce. Really enjoyed it. I was just thinking as you were answering the question about the MPS meeting, that there's one style writing a history where you're focusing on an individual. And this is Hayek and you, and you could study how Hayek changed the things that causes it to change. And of course, this is a hot topic, right? Hayek is hot not only because lots of people write on Hayek, the person, but hot for the reason that you mentioned at the outset of your topic. And I just wondered maybe how much of that heat might be attributed to taking a different historiographical approach. So one can look at Hayek, the person. A lot of the things that I've read recently on Hayek look at Hayek as a member of a group. And when you engage with those works, does that tension strike you? Are you pulled into talking that way? Are there resistances there, just purely from the different historiographical approaches?
Right. So he's, in this part of the biography, he's only done that first meeting, and then they have a meeting in 49 and an executive committee meeting in 48. The Mont Pelerin Society exists today. This will be the 75th anniversary of that 47 meeting. It'll take place in Oslo, and they're giving out the book there that I just mentioned. And that was one of the reasons I did the book, was kind of, this is 75th anniversary. Here's what the first meeting was like. But I'm going to be doing a lot more about the Mont Pelerin Society and Hayek's relationship, for example, to funders, which I know is of great interest to lots of people. And the relationship that he had with members of this group, which ended up starting as, the first meeting had lots of Americans and lots of Europeans, and then for the next 10 years, it was mostly Europeans. Although there were a few people came from America, but like Mises and Topper, Friedman didn't attend until 10 years later did he attend the second meeting. So his relationship with a number of these academics who are united in the pursuit of the defense of liberalism is something that will be taken up more in that second volume, which is a clever way of me just really ducking the question. So we'll see. We'll see. Certainly open to new approaches and to hearing your advice on it.
For our last question, I think I'm going to give it to John DeVecchio here, because it's a question that's actually interesting to me as well. So John just says, thanks, Bruce, terrific talk. One question, any news about the relation between Hayek and Carl Menger, the son, not just about the second edition of Menger Sr.'s principles, but in a broader sense? Did you learn anything about Carl and Fritz?
They had a correspondence, and they had, I think that they liked each other. But I don't read German, so I wasn't reading those letters.
Well, I will say that were it not for Hans Jorg and his detective abilities, that paper that Reinhardt and I published a couple of years ago on Man of the Sun would never have been published. I mean, Hans Jorg is wonderful.
Yeah.
Anyways, we're at the end. Another round of applause for Bruce.
I'm gonna turn off the.
Thank you, everybody.